I remember the day my mother sighed and said, "You know, Emily, you're just too quiet, too easy to overlook." She said it like it was a flaw, something inherently wrong with me. That moment wasn't the beginning of anything really, but it stays with me now because it feels like the first time I truly understood what they thought of me. What everyone thought of me. I've always been the kind of person who blends into the background. Not invisible, exactly, just not worth noticing for long. I'm Emily Carter, 32 years old, living in a small town outside Chicago where nothing much happens and no one expects it to. I work as an office manager at a dental practice, a job that suits me because it's predictable and quiet. My life is simple. Mornings spent sipping coffee while watching the sunrise, evenings curled up with a book or taking long walks through the neighborhood. People describe me as nice, dependable, maybe a little boring, and that's fine by me. Or at least it used to be. My family has never seen simplicity as a virtue. They're loud, opinionated, and perpetually dissatisfied with themselves, with each other, and especially with me. There's my mother, Patricia, who runs her life like she's orchestrating a Broadway show, every scene meticulously planned and every line rehearsed. Then there's my older brother, Ryan, whose charisma masks a deep-seated sense of entitlement. He's the golden child, the one who can do no wrong, even when he does plenty wrong. Finally, there's Dad, who mostly stays out of things unless he's asked to referee, which isn't often. He prefers his recliner and the nightly news to family drama. For years, I convinced myself their dismissiveness didn't matter. After all, families are complicated, right? Everyone has quirks and blind spots. But what I didn't realize then was how insidious neglect could be, how those tiny moments of dismissal added up to something heavier than I could carry without breaking. It started small. A birthday forgotten again because we assumed you wouldn't want to fuss. A dinner party where I was seated at the far end of the table, next to a cousin I barely knew, while Ryan held court at the center. Little comments about how I should speak up more or put myself out there, as if my natural reserve was somehow shameful. Each incident felt minor on its own, but over time, they carved away at me, piece by piece. The worst part was how I reacted, or rather, how I didn't react. I told myself it wasn't worth fighting over. I swallowed my hurt and smiled politely, assuring them everything was fine. Inside, though, something was shifting. Resentment grew like a slow-moving storm, darkening corners of my mind I hadn't known existed. Still, I stayed silent. Silence felt safer than confrontation, easier than risking rejection. But silence also meant complicity, and somewhere along the way, I began to hate myself for it. One evening stands out in particular. We were gathered for Thanksgiving at my parents' house, the dining room filled with the smell of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie. The conversation flowed easily among everyone else, laughter punctuating the air. I sat quietly, picking at my food, when Ryan leaned back in his chair and said, almost casually, "You know, you'd probably get more out of life if you weren't so passive." The table fell silent for half a second before Mom chimed in with a nervous laugh. "Oh, Ryan, don't be harsh. Emily's just content being behind the scenes. Someone has to keep things running smoothly after all." Behind the scenes. That phrase stuck with me like a splinter under my skin. It wasn't the first time I'd heard it, or variations of it, but this time, something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet, definitive shift. I looked around the table at their faces, the smug confidence on Ryan's, the faintly pitying smile on Mom's, and realized I didn't owe them explanations anymore. From that moment on, I stopped trying to justify myself. If they criticized my choices, I nodded politely and changed the subject. If they made plans without consulting me, I let them, without protest. It wasn't defiance, it was detachment. I withdrew emotionally, creating a space between us that none of them seemed to notice or care about. To them, I was still the same unremarkable Emily, the one who didn't make waves. What they didn't see was that I was changing, slowly, but irrevocably. As weeks turned into months, their behavior toward me grew worse. Without my protests to push against, they became bolder, more careless. Ryan started borrowing money from me without asking, assuming I wouldn't say no. Mom began delegating tasks to me during family gatherings, treating me like an unpaid assistant rather than her daughter. Even Dad, usually the neutral party, joined in, once suggesting I take on extra responsibilities at work so Ryan could focus on his big opportunities. Each slight chipped away at whatever remained of my patience, but instead of lashing out, I retreated further into myself. I started keeping a mental tally of their actions, cataloging every insult, every demand, every assumption. The list grew longer, but I kept it hidden, letting it simmer beneath the surface. Meanwhile, I focused on building my own life outside of theirs. I redecorated my apartment, took up yoga, and began volunteering at a local animal shelter. These small acts of independence gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. Internally, I wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to confront them, to force them to acknowledge what they'd done. Another part, a stronger part, knew that confrontation would only feed their egos. So I chose a different path: self-respect. I reminded myself daily that their opinions didn't define me, that my worth wasn't tied to their approval. Slowly, I began to believe it. Then came the first ripple of karma, subtle but undeniable. Ryan missed a crucial deadline at work, costing him a promotion he'd been counting on. When he called me, frustrated and looking for someone to blame, I listened calmly and offered vague condolences. Later, Mom complained to me about a neighbor spreading rumors about her, rumors she insisted weren't true. Again, I listened without comment, offering neither comfort nor judgment. For the first time, I noticed cracks forming in their carefully constructed facades. Their certainty wavered, replaced by unease. Time passed, and the cracks widened. Ryan's financial mismanagement caught up with him, forcing him to sell his car and move into a smaller apartment. Mom's social circle began to shrink as old friends drifted away, leaving her isolated and defensive. Even Dad seemed quieter, less sure of himself. None of them connected these events to me. I made sure of that, but I couldn't help feeling a grim satisfaction as their worlds unraveled bit by bit. Still, I waited. Revenge, I decided, wasn't about rushing toward resolution. It was about savoring the inevitability of justice, watching as the universe corrected itself in ways I could never have orchestrated. Every setback they faced felt like a step closer to balance, a reminder that silence could be its own form of power. And yet, the story isn't finished. There's more to come, more threads to weave together before the tapestry is complete. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything that's happened, I feel the weight of anticipation pressing down on me. Something is coming, an ending, perhaps, or maybe just another chapter. Either way, I'm ready. Days turned into weeks, and the cracks in my family's facade continued to widen. Ryan's financial troubles worsened, forcing him to take on odd jobs that barely covered his rent. Mom, desperate to maintain her image of perfection, threw herself into organizing charity events, only to find fewer and fewer people willing to participate. Her social circle shrank further, leaving her increasingly anxious and defensive. Dad grew quieter, his health seemingly declining, though he never openly admitted it. Meanwhile, I continued living my life, focusing on personal growth and inner peace. I made new friends in my yoga class, people who appreciated my quiet nature and thoughtful presence rather than trying to change me. I also started keeping a journal, recording my observations and feelings about the family dynamics. Writing became an outlet for my emotions and a way to redefine myself on my own terms. One evening, as I sorted through some old photo albums, I came across a family portrait. In the picture, we all looked so happy, smiling brightly, as if nothing could ever go wrong. But I knew better. That happiness had always been superficial, a fragile veneer masking deeper fractures. I stared at my younger self in the photograph, the version of me who still believed she needed their approval to feel whole. Something shifted inside me then, a quiet resolve solidifying. I realized that while they were consumed by their struggles, I had been steadily building a life independent of their chaos, a life rooted in dignity and self-respect. For years, I had allowed them to define me, to shape how I saw myself. No longer. Their neglect had unintentionally set me free, teaching me that silence wasn't weakness, but strength when wielded with purpose. A few days later, Mom called unexpectedly. Her voice trembled as she spoke, uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Emily, I need your help," she said, skipping any pretense of pleasantries. "The gala next week, it's falling apart. People are canceling left and right, and I don't know what to do." I hesitated, gripping the phone tightly. This was the moment I'd waited for without realizing it, the chance to assert myself, not through confrontation, but through choice. "I'm sorry, Mom," I replied softly, "but I can't. I have plans that night." There was a long pause before she responded, her tone sharpening with frustration. "Plans? What could possibly be more important than helping your own mother?" Her words stung, but not as deeply as they once would have. Instead of reacting defensively, I simply repeated, "I'm sorry, Mom. I hope it works out." Then I ended the call. As I set the phone down, I felt a surprising sense of relief. It wasn't defiance or rebellion, it was clarity. By saying no, I wasn't rejecting her. I was honoring myself. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something larger was looming on the horizon, something that would force us all to confront truths we'd buried beneath layers of denial. The following week brought news that sent shockwaves through our fractured family. Dad collapsed at home one morning and was rushed to the hospital. The diagnosis was dire: heart failure, requiring immediate surgery and extensive recovery. When Mom called to inform me, her voice broke under the weight of fear and uncertainty. "He needs us now, Emily," she pleaded. "We have to come together." For a brief moment, I considered refusing, retreating further into the boundaries I'd built around myself. But then I remembered the man beneath the silences, the father who, despite his flaws, had loved me in his own quiet way. Perhaps this was karma's final twist, forcing us to face each other, stripped of pretenses and pride. I arrived at the hospital prepared to play my part, whatever that might be. Yet as I walked into the waiting room and saw their faces, Mom's tear-streaked cheeks, Ryan's clenched jaw, I realized that none of us were the same people we'd been before. We were shadows of our former selves, worn down by choices and consequences neither of us fully understood. What happens next remains unwritten. Will we find a way to mend what's broken, or will the fractures deepen until there's nothing left to salvage? I don't know yet, but I do know this: I won't lose myself again in the process. Whatever comes, I'll face it with the same quiet strength that has carried me this far. And so, the story pauses here, not at an ending but at a crossroads. The tension lingers, unresolved, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The days that followed Dad's hospitalization felt like living in a fog. Time blurred together, each moment heavy with unspoken emotions and unresolved tensions. Mom oscillated between frantic energy and defeated silence, while Ryan seemed lost, his usual bravado replaced by a brittle vulnerability. As for me, I kept my distance, not out of indifference but because I needed clarity before stepping fully into whatever came next. Dad's surgery was successful, though the road to recovery promised to be long and uncertain. During those first few weeks, we took turns visiting him at the hospital, each of us bringing our own baggage into the sterile, fluorescent-lit room. Conversations were stilted, filled with awkward pauses and forced pleasantries. It wasn't until one particularly quiet evening that everything changed. I had stayed late after everyone else left, sitting beside Dad as he dozed off. His frailty struck me then, not just physically but emotionally. This man who had always been a pillar of stoic strength now seemed so fragile, so human. A wave of compassion washed over me, softening some of the hardness I'd built around my heart. But it wasn't enough to erase years of neglect. Not yet. As I prepared to leave, Mom walked in unexpectedly. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She hesitated near the doorway, then finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Emily, can we talk?" We stepped outside into the dimly lit hallway, where she leaned against the wall, arms crossed tightly over her chest. For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the floor. Then, without warning, she blurted out, "I don't know how to fix this." Her words caught me off guard. Fix what? Our strained relationship? The family dynamic that had crumbled under the weight of its own dysfunction? Or maybe just the guilt she carried for all the times she dismissed me, ignored me, treated me like an afterthought? "I don't think you can," I replied softly, not unkindly. "Some things can't be fixed, Mom. They have to heal or fade away." She flinched at my response, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For us to fade away?" Her question hung between us, raw and aching. Part of me wanted to say yes, to let go of the ties that bound me to them and walk away forever. But another part, the part that still remembered the rare moments of warmth and connection we'd shared, couldn't bring myself to sever those threads entirely. "No," I admitted finally. "But I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person I used to be. I won't keep sacrificing pieces of myself to make you comfortable anymore." Mom nodded slowly, her tears falling faster now. "I see that," she whispered. "And I'm sorry, Emily. Truly sorry." Her apology didn't erase the past, but it was a start, a crack in the armor of denial they'd worn for so long. Over the next several days, similar conversations unfolded with Ryan and even Dad, though his were punctuated by long silences and halting admissions of regret. Each of them, in their own way, began to acknowledge the harm they'd caused, not just to me, but to each other. Karma arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the months that followed. Ryan, humbled by his failures, started taking responsibility for his life in ways he never had before. He found steady work and moved into a modest apartment, learning to live within his means. Mom, stripped of her social status, turned inward, discovering hobbies and passions she'd abandoned years ago. And Dad, weakened but reflective, began opening up about his fears and regrets, sharing parts of himself he'd kept hidden for decades. As for me, I continued building the life I'd created outside of their orbit. My quiet revenge wasn't about destruction or retribution, it was about transformation. Through patience and self-respect, I had forced them to confront their flaws, to see me not as an extension of themselves, but as a whole, independent person. In doing so, I had reclaimed my power. One crisp autumn afternoon, as golden leaves swirled in the wind, I received a letter from Dad. Inside was a handwritten note and a small key. The note read simply, "For Emily, you've earned this." Curious, I drove to my parents' house later that day. When I arrived, Mom handed me a wooden box engraved with intricate patterns. It was old, clearly cherished, and heavier than it looked. Inside the box, I found letters, dozens of them, written to me over the years but never sent. Some were apologetic, others full of pride and love, all bearing traces of hesitation and fear. At the bottom lay a deed to a small cabin by the lake, a place I'd loved visiting as a child. Tears welled in my eyes as I looked up at them, standing there together, vulnerable and hopeful. "Why now?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Because we're tired of losing you," Mom said simply. "And because it's time." In that moment, I felt the weight of years lift slightly, replaced by something fragile yet profound. Forgiveness. Not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that makes space for healing. Quiet revenge had brought me here, not to destroy, but to rebuild. And though the scars would always remain, so too would the strength I had gained along the way. The story ends, not with closure, but with possibility. A new chapter begins, one where justice takes the form of understanding and revenge becomes redemption.